Hey there. In my last video, we talked about the divisive reception to the plot twist and ending of Age of Calamity, about how some people were really upset by it, whereas others are excited and happy. Some people are worried about what it means for the timeline, whereas others are convinced it's just non-canon. I also talked about how I felt about the ending, about how I was going into it prepared to hate the story, but that it ended up winning me over in a really big way, though I do still have some reservations. And I gotta say, you guys seem to have really liked that video. I got about 140 new subscribers as of recording this, which is a big deal for me considering I only had about 1,400. That means my channel literally grew 10% in size as a result of that video. So for anyone who subscribed because of that video, thank you so much. In this video, I want to build off what we established in the previous video and talk about whether or not Age of Calamity actually is canon. Much like opinions on the ending itself, there are a lot of people debating whether or not Age of Calamity actually happened, with some thinking that Age of Calamity absolutely is canon and will have a major impact on the series going forward. Others think that it's just a what-if scenario with no legitimacy, similar to the first Hyrule Warriors. After all, the first Hyrule Warriors isn't canon, so it makes sense that the sequel wouldn't be canon either. And since this one changes the story so dramatically, it's obviously not a real story, right? Well, I'm not so sure. Truthfully, we don't know what the, canonicity of the game is going to be, and we won't until Aonuma or somebody else at the Zelda team says something about it. But I'm inclined to believe that the game is canon, primarily because we've never been given a reason to believe it isn't. In no interview or advertising material has Age of Calamity ever been referred to as non-canon or not a real Zelda game or anything of the sort. And here is the thing. It shouldn't be the default position to assume that it's going to be non-canon unless otherwise specified. The reverse should be true, and we should assume that the game is canon until otherwise told differently. The argument that Aonuma or Miyamoto haven't explicitly said this game really takes place, thus it shouldn't be considered canon, isn't a compelling argument for me. What counts as confirmation? Placement in the timeline? That would mean until the early 2010s, when the timeline was created, the Zelda games as a whole didn't actually take place. That doesn't really make sense to me. Most Zelda games aren't explicitly said to be canon, we just assume they will be. What people really mean when they say that is because Age of Calamity is a spin-off, it needs further extra confirmation. And fair enough, I don't really agree, but that's a more understandable argument. The thing is, there's been plenty of confirmation. Nintendo themselves, and Aonuma specifically, have repeatedly referred to this game as the events that take place during the Great Calamity. They don't say an interpretation of events or an imaginary version of events that take place during the Calamity. It's fairly explicit. And I'm sorry, but Aonuma's direct words are always going to take precedent over your interpretations of them. Not to mention, its existence as a Hyrule Warriors game doesn't immediately lump it in as non-canon. Here's the thing, if it was non-canon, Nintendo would have no issue just telling us that. During interviews leading up to the first Hyrule Warriors game, Nintendo was very straightforward about the fact that the game wasn't canon. I have absolutely no reason to believe that Nintendo wouldn't be willing to just tell us if Age of Calamity didn't really happen. And then the last thing that sort of gives me doubt about Age of Calamity being not canon is just the fact that it looks like it was a pretty expensive game for Nintendo to produce. There were a lot of new cutscenes in this game, and while many of the assets definitely were reused from Breath of the Wild, a lot of them were brushed up and modified. And tons of new assets were brought in. An insane amount of voice acting had to be done, not to mention a lot of animating for the many characters who are playable. This was not a cheap game for Nintendo to make, not to mention that the game got actually quite a large marketing campaign. It was everywhere, and marketing is expensive. There is no way in my mind that Nintendo would be willing to pour this much money, attention, and time into a game that they're just going to cast aside as being make-believe. TLDR, we shouldn't assume it's non-canon until told otherwise. The fact that it's a Hyrule Warriors game doesn't mean it's not canon, considering that they outright told us the first one was non-canon, and have been advertising this one as the events of the Calamity. They also spent way too much money on it for it to be just fake. No, I think the game definitely is canon. I know that's a scary thought for a lot of people, myself included, in regards to what that could do for the timeline, and in particular, its potential impact on Breath of the Wild 2. We'll sort of touch on that in this video, but my next video will explore what Age of Calamity could mean for the timeline in full. So please consider subscribing and ringing the bell if you'd like to be notified of that video and hear my thoughts. So here's the thing. The fact that the story plays out differently from Breath of the Wild doesn't mean that it's immediately non-canon. There's a half dozen ways that Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity's story could still be valid. The first option, which is the one that I want the least and the one that I think people are most worried about, is the idea that this all exists on one timeline, and that in going to the past and changing things, it permanently changed the future, and thus the calamity was inverted. In this type of time travel, there's only one reality that's being changed, or at least it's the only reality that really matters, because it's the only one we see. For example, it is possible that in Majora's Mask, a new branch of time is created every time you go back 3 days. It's perfectly possible and maybe even likely, but because the only reality we pay attention to is the one that Link returns to, those other time branches might as well not exist. The only one relevant is the one being paid attention to. This is also the case with time travel in games like Skyward Sword and Oracle of Ages. If this is the case, then Age of Calamity is canon because it is the new future. The events of Breath of the Wild are retroactively erased in this scenario, and Breath of the Wild 2 would take place after Age of Calamity. This is the scenario that I want the least, and the one that most people are scared of, but I don't think that we need to worry about it too much. I believe it's much more likely to be the second scenario. Terrako was from the Breath of the Wild timeline, and when he jumped back in time, it created an entirely new timeline. The timeline he left plays out like normal, and that's the timeline Breath of the Wild is in. This new timeline, created when Terrako jumps back, plays out as we see in Age of Calamity and ends with an averted calamity and a hopeful future. In this scenario, these two timelines run alongside one another. One doesn't invalidate the other, they both exist, just in their own universes. I see people often say that if this is the case, then it basically means that Age of Calamity is non-canon because it's in an alternate universe, and this just absolutely baffles me. This is Zelda we're talking about. The bulk of the games take place across one of 3 alternate universes. Do you think that only one of those universes is canon and the rest never happened? The Age of Calamity split is essentially the same as the time travel split in Ocarina of Time. The only difference is that it's Terrako jumping through a portal as opposed to Link pulling a sword from its pedestal. Even if the Age of Calamity timeline is never visited again, that also doesn't mean it isn't canon or doesn't really exist. Are Termina or the World of the Ocean King non-canon because we only visit them once? I certainly don't think so. So those are the scenarios that could still result in the game being canon despite the events contradicting Breath of the Wild. In my next video, I'll go much more in depth into these different ideas, specifically in how they'll relate to Breath of the Wild 2. But this suffices for how they relate to the game's canonicity. I understand this is a divisive topic and one that I've seen people get very heated over, but I want to genuinely thank you guys for being so civil in the comments for my last video. I only had one objectively rude person over about 100 comments and a few who were just passive aggressive, but the overwhelming majority of you were civil and had a lot of interesting things to say. I hope that continues for this video. As I said, consider subscribing so you can catch the next video. I also have a Twitter and a Discord if you want to get a hold of me to chat about anything. And thanks again for the huge amount of support on the last video. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe out there. Repair your Terrako as soon as you can. You need someone at your back out there in those Hylian battlefields because it's dangerous to go alone.